Name is Larry Snow, State Representative, and I'm one of the chairs, and seated to my right is our Lieutenant Governor Henderson, who is the other, can you hear me better now? Who is the other co-chair? And we recognize her and recognize the other members of our commission. So we'll call the meeting to order. We're going to get started with the agenda. Just as way of background, our board continues to make significant progress with this project. Since our March meeting, we have, among other things, begun the final stage of the process to select our phase one development partners by meeting with all the candidates and providing updated project information. We've completed the stage one review of a new hospitality project proposal, refined the supplemental studies to help the board make informed decisions on project enhancements, completed the draft of our design guidelines, refined the project financial framework and pro forma, cultivated key partnerships. We've been featured in several national media stories. And I would say everything that I've seen that way has been positive. We've coordinated the transition to the new correctional facility with the Department of Corrections. And as I understand it, and Jim may comment, but that could take place and should take place sometime this summer. We've worked with DFCM and Draper City to advance early infrastructure work and much more. Our staff has done much more behind the scenes, and we appreciate them. We're going to discuss some of those activities that I've mentioned in our meeting. So with that, we'll move on with the agenda. The second item on the agenda is something that we take up every meeting, and that's taking time for public comment. Members of the public are encouraged to attend this meeting in person as well as virtually. And not only attend, but they're welcome to make comments subject to the restrictions that we've approved as part of our policies and procedures. Just as a reminder, the Point is a public project. And as a board, we have a responsibility, and we take seriously that responsibility to ensure this project provides broad public benefits. Accordingly, we value input from members of the public. In fact, over 10,000 Utah residents have shared their priorities and ideas and their feedback, which has guided our planning thus far. We welcome public comments, as I said, following the procedures outlined on the agenda. Those who wish to speak that are here in person may raise their hand and we will call on them. Or if you are attending virtually and would like to speak, if you will raise your hand icon that's part of your Zoom connection. That all done to facilitate public comment. So I know that there are some members of the public here personally that would like to speak. One particular talked to me earlier, I think, last week. But I understand there's some others here. So if you would like to comment as a member of the public, if you'd raise your hand. And why don't we start with the lady? And if you'll come forward and take a seat, we'll get you a mic on. And the director, remind me how much time? So if you can limit your comments to 3 minutes, we'd appreciate that. And we'll turn the time. Let me have you start by telling us your name, and if you represent a body or a group, let us know that.
Thank you very much. You're very generous with your time. Normally, government entities only give me 2 minutes. 3 minutes is much more comfortable regarding content. My name is Cindy Cromer, and I have already spoken to you twice this year about my experiences at the prison and my interest in seeing the history of the place reflected in its redevelopment. If there is a long list today of potential speakers, I hope you'll just cut me off now because I have already been before you twice. Back in January, which is what it looks like outside this morning, I talked to you about the remarkable positive experiences I have had at the prison and benefits to me personally from the educational opportunities and skills trainings offered to the residents there. And then last month, I urged you to consider that being responsible for the redevelopment of the prison includes being honorable about the site in its redevelopment. And the range to river corridor is precisely that. It honors and respects the natural history of the site. Today, I want to talk about my own experiences again and what it means to live in a sustainable place, my own 15-minute neighborhood in Salt Lake City. I have been in the kind of neighborhood you aspire to create for almost 50 years. All of the services I need are within a 15-minute walk of my home and office. How does spending most of my life in such an efficient place affect the way I analyze information? Well, as I read the chapter on sustainability, which is supposed to offer a national model for sustainability, I immediately thought about the contrast between the proposed diversion of construction debris from new buildings and the lack of information about the debris from demolition. I don't see how the consultants can talk about being a national model for sustainability when the plan for diversion of waste focuses on new construction and the target percentages range from 75%, which would be really impressive, to 16.75%, with the caveat requires further study. That's in quotes. And focusing on the diversion of waste from new construction appears to lack honesty to me if the entire complex goes to the dump, except for a watchtower, which is, of course, a symbol of surveillance. There isn't much text in that chapter on sustainability. And I want to assure you that based on my own experience with rehabbing old buildings, contractors do not slow down to recycle. I urge you to elaborate on how the diversion of waste will be monitored and how the target percentages will be achieved, strategies for implementation. And if the recycling of debris from demolition is not part of the diversion, then I am arguing that the project can't be a model for sustainability at all, because it begins with a failure to address the recycling of materials from the proposed demolitions. I'll close with a quick story. I am currently restoring the home of Orson Pratt Jr., the first child of Orson Pratt Sr. And while other people were complaining about the cost of wood and problems with supply chains for the past 2 years, the general contractor working at the Pratt house was using 19th century lumber harvested from the house itself. That was an honest approach. It also proved to be the most cost-effective and fastest. It was, in fact, sustainable. Living in a 15-minute community for 50 years has made that clear to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Cromer. And next, one of you gentlemen. Good morning and welcome to our commission.
Good morning. My name is Paul Hewitt, and I'm here representing Wasatch Presbyterian Church here in Salt Lake City. We've been doing prison ministry out at the Draper Prison at both the Wasatch and Ochre Chapel since 1985. I'd like to entitle my remarks today, "The Least, the Last, and the Lost." Consider an inmate's joy on seeing his name printed in a program. Here's a program of one of the 4 traditional services we do each year with the inmates celebrating either Independence Day, Thanksgiving, Christmas, or Easter. And following one of those times, the volunteers and the inmates have a chance to just mingle and talk. And this one inmate came up to her that one evening, and he was pointing to his name in the program. And he was just thrilled. He says, "I have never seen my name in print in any kind of a program before." It was very meaningful. Now consider the 64-year history of the Chapel by the Wayside at the Draper Prison. It's an important physical reminder of the history, context, and individuals who have worked, volunteered, and been incarcerated in that place since 1952. I might add that I remember I was a newspaper boy, Deseret News, looking at the headlines in the paper the day the prisoners moved from the Sugar House prison out to Draper, 1952. They were on school buses, these yellow school buses, and they were waving out the windows as they headed out to Draper. Let's let's not, let's see, it's an important physical reminder of the history, context, and individuals who have worked, volunteered, and been incarcerated in that place. Let's not relegate them to the least, the last, and the lost, who, if this chapel is destroyed, will be forgotten. It's personal for me. 25 or so years ago, on a regularly scheduled Tuesday night Bible study, 4 inmates in the company of 20 of their fellow inmates bathed the feet of our prison ministry team at the chapel. They did this out of regard, trust, respect, and appreciation for the work we did there with them. This would never have happened without Chaplain Dennis Marsh's approval. Coincidentally, this coming Friday, April 15th, is Good Friday on the Christian calendar. It tells the story of how Jesus, on the night of his arrest, would celebrate Passover with his disciples. At their meal, he shared the cup and a loaf of bread with them, symbolizing the sacrifice he was about to endure on their behalf. He then bathed their feet, demonstrating for them their future lives as humble servants, the least, the last, and to the least, the last, and the lost, in his name. Consider the fate of the Utah Territorial Prison built in Sugar House in 1858. Nothing was preserved except the Highland High School, which was built on the site. Highland took its school colors from the black and white stripes of the uniforms of the prisoners who once walked that ground. Governor Cox has declared today, April 12th, 2022, as One Kind Act a Day to promote acts of kindness. Let's seize this opportunity to remember and lift up the entire story of the Utah State Prison at Draper, Utah, by committing today to preserve, rededicate, and gratefully utilize the chapel by the wayside into perpetuity. Let's preserve one positive and meaningful structure from the past on just one of 700 acres, now committed to and beautifully designed for the future use and success of Utah and its people. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Hewitt, thank you for joining us and for your comments. All right, Mr. Burton. Welcome to our commission, Steve.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it. I've testified in this room several times, but it's usually on criminal justice issues. And I'm usually in front of a legislative committee. My name's Steve Burton. I'm a local attorney. And I've been following this project for some time. And I just wanted to share what my development of thoughts has been. When the federal courthouse was constructed in Salt Lake City, when we found out that that was going to happen, I thought, what a fantastic opportunity. I can't wait to see what kind of amazing architecture they come up with. And, this is such an opportunity. How often do they build a federal courthouse? And then what ended up happening was they built a big, gigantic cube. And all of the attorneys that I know of, they jokingly say, well, it's the big Borg cube. And that was what they did to seize this opportunity. And another opportunity won't come along. There won't be another federal courthouse in my lifetime. In following this project, I've read some of those articles that were mentioned about the 15-minute city, and it all sounds interesting, and I think it's a great idea. And as was stated, those have been positive articles. But I have to say that if at the end of this project, several years from now, when we see what has been created and we think, hey, there's our 15-minute city that we created, I think that will probably be the missed opportunity of a generation. And the last thing that I want is, just like when I drive past that federal courthouse and see that magnificent new structure and think, well, that was a missed opportunity. That's the thought that comes to my mind every single time. I don't want to have to, every time I drive to Utah County or back up to Salt Lake City, every time I drive past the point of the mountain, look over and say, well, that was the missed opportunity of a generation. I just returned from 2 weeks in Italy. And seeing the types of monuments that they have created there throughout their history truly inspires me. Everywhere I go, I see something that they tried to create that would last throughout all of time, something that was iconic, something that people could go and see and be inspired by. And a lot of the cities in Europe have these iconic symbols where somebody goes to that city and says, I need to go there and I need to take a picture to say that I have been there. There's things like the Seattle Space Needle, there's the Arch in St. Louis, there's the Bean in Chicago, there's the Eiffel Tower in Paris. There are these iconic symbols where everyone in the world sees that symbol and knows that it's describing a place or it's connected with a place. And so my hope is as we go through this process, I mean, if we're to the point where we're choosing a developer, I would think that we should probably be able to tell the developer, or at least give the developer an idea of what they're in for or what we expect as far as creating something that we want our children and our children's children to see and experience and be proud of, to be inspired by. Just a couple more thoughts. I know that this has been mentioned, but I think that the governor in his plan, he wanted there to be this iconic symbol. And I was appreciative of that, except that with each map that I see, there's nothing indicating that there's an effort to plan for this, to really put an effort forth and create this. The famous Duomo in Florence, it was created because there was a public contest saying, how do we create this magnificent dome? Same with Brunelleschi's doors. And the World Trade Center, there's been these public contests. So I'm not smart enough to create something that is iconic for all of time, but I do think there are people out there who are, and I would hope that there would be some kind of effort or some kind of appropriation made by the legislature to put forth some money to try to bring those ideas to the table. And I think there's lots of ideas that we could merge nature or merge the ideals of Utah and put it together in some kind of iconic structure or iconic artistic project. That's my hope. And unfortunately, I know there was a request by the governor for that appropriation, but it wasn't appropriated this session. So my hope is that we get serious about it, especially if we're moving forward to development, so that I don't have to drive past the point of the mountain and just look over and say, man, that was the missed opportunity of a generation.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for being with us and
Thank you.
thanks for your comment. And it's always good to hear from you, whether it's on criminal justice or on this subject too.
Thank you, Representative Snow.
Thanks. Muriel or staff, can you tell me, do we have someone virtually with their hand up that we need to call in? Okay, it looks like Mr. Evans, James Evans, if you can hear me, if you would unmute your mic and we'll give you 3 minutes.
Okay, can you hear me?
If you'll start by telling us your name and then you can go ahead.
My name is James Evans, and I was asked to speak to you today. I spent 21 years in Draper facility in different areas, and it has a lot of bad memories, a lot of bad stuff throughout all of the years, the history, but it has so much of Utah's history that probably should be carried on for the criminal justice classes, the students, the people that want to know what's happened in these valleys and the history of the prison. It is quite fascinating, and to be able to preserve something like the chapel or something somewhere that people can see. I know other states have done so. I don't want to get too crazy building something or making something for it, but it would be important and mean a lot to probably the future. And I know it meant everything to my future, to what I took away from there, the positive, not the bad. So it's the way they live, but it can be a future reminder, future thing for the young kids to know better. Had I known or seen it, maybe it made a big difference before I got in trouble. But I was grateful for being there when I was, because obviously I needed to be there and I never would have become what I am now today and survive. So it does offer the guys very excellent opportunities for us to look back and remember the good friendships that have come with us, the people and the lives and the volunteers that have put in so much for the inmates at a place like that is what counts so much. To see them, they can take their kids and show them what they've done for society today instead of just turning some creep out on the streets. They put in the time. And so did the old guards, the old school guards actually cared. They had to be guards, but they cared. They treated us humanly as best as they could to make sure we made it out of there with some dignity. So it is, it's a weighing scale of good and bad, but I think it can still positively be good in the future for somebody if the right things are done.
Thank you very much, James, for your comment. And I'm glad that you could join us this morning. The next person virtually that would like to comment I have is Kevin Walkenhorst. Kevin, if you can hear me, if you'll unmute your mic, introduce yourself and give us your comment.
Hi, my name's Kevin Walkenhorst, and thank you for this opportunity. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you perfectly.
Thank you. I grew up in Draper. My dad worked at the prison. We would take him dinner out there as children and in the main tower there. I used to get my hair cut by the prisoners out there, and it was such a memorable thing. Of course, as a child, you're a little bit nervous, but then you realize really what the place is all about and what's unique about it as a kid. I played basketball out there with the prisoners, and I ministered there. Many of you have probably heard the name of Heber Gertz. He changed many lives out there, as well as many others in their ministry out there. It was a vibrant part of our community, especially for the people of Draper, but also the people around Draper. I always hear people, when I say I'm from Draper, always comment on what a unique, beautiful place it is. And they always refer to the historical aspects of it, particularly farming, poultry farms, dairy farms, and whatever. But it has a unique, wonderful reputation. And my interest is in preserving parts of the prison so that we can help establish that tie and make it a destination location that embodies the best of our past, present, and future. Too many places demolish their historical places. And as I've traveled the world, it's always interesting when we go on tours that one of the main tours and locations, whether it's a Caribbean cruise or across America, is a prison site, and holding the unique history of that in the community. But the majority of my career has been spent in advertising, marketing, communications, and I come to understand and value the importance of brand and brand identity, which is really who you are as a product, who you are as a community. And it's both the visual and verbal communication of who you are. And strong identities always win in the long run in establishing the identities that need to be established. And so I would urge the commission and others to consider preserving some of these elements to continue making Draper a destination, both visually and verbally, for people, and establishing this brand in this corner of the valley that people can look to and say, Draper did it right. And that's all I had. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Kevin, for your comments. Thank you for joining with us virtually this morning. So I believe that's the last of the comments from the public. We again appreciate your attendance, and also for those who have commented today. Moving on with the agenda, the next item is to consider approving the minutes of our board meeting held March 8th. Excuse me, let me turn off the alarm. To approve the minutes of our meeting held March 8th, 2022. Chair would entertain a motion to that effect. So moved by Jim. All in favor of that motion? Excuse me, I need a second. Thank you, David. It's been moved and seconded. We approve the minutes of March the 8th, 2022. All in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed- Any opposed, say nay. The minutes are approved by unanimous vote. The next item on our agenda, item number 4, that's listed as design guidelines. We welcome Peter Kindle from SOM and Steve Kellenberg, our consultant. We will review today the draft of the design guidelines for the point. That as way of background, the point's design guidelines are a critical tool to achieve the board's vision. By the way, for your information, I think many of you know this, but for any development of this size and scope, not just in terms of size, but the complexity requires architectural and other guidelines for those who are looking to participate in the development of the project. It's not unusual. And so with this project, it requires a fairly high level of sophistication in order to help us come up with the right guidelines for a very large mixed-use development. The guidelines include standards to provide direction to developers as they plan and implement the project. As you all saw in your board packets, the standards include elements such as street design, architectural elements, building materials, approved colors, streetscapes, and signage. Our planning team from SOM has drafted the design guidelines with extensive input from our staff. We anticipate the design guidelines will evolve with further input from the board and ours as the development progresses with our development partners. So we welcome today Pete Kendall, as I said. He will introduce the draft design guidelines, and we also recognize our own consultant, Steve Kellenberg, to make additional comments, and we will facilitate board discussion. So with that, Peter and Steve will turn the time to you and ask you to present.
I'll just make a couple of introductory comments. We've been working on these guidelines for probably a good 6 months now. As I think the chair's already sort of given good background to the role that these play in the development process. It's one thing to do a master plan, but you have to implement it. And we're going to have many developers involved in this project over the coming decades. And so we need some sort of rules of engagement, some sort of common set of principles and criteria to create a consistent set of buildings, public realm, streetscapes that kind of hold the whole project together, as well as maintain a high level of design excellence. The idea is that these guidelines are, they have the opportunity to evolve over time. As we put them in place and as we see design submissions come in, we'll probably identify things that need to be adjusted. There will be a design review committee that will implement these, that will, as different proposals come in at different levels of design, from conceptual down to working drawings, the design review committee will review and provide input back to the proponent of the project to make sure that there's reasonable conformity. But with that brief background, I'll hand it over to Peter, who will walk us through a short presentation, an overview. These guidelines are about 100 pages long, so you're not going to see them all. If anybody would like a copy, we can certainly make them available, but he's going to give a brief overview of sort of the key components at this time. So feel free, Pete, to proceed.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Representative Snow. It's great to see everybody again. As Steve mentioned, the purpose of the guidelines is to control and direct the actual implementation of the framework plan. And the framework plan established a specific vision back in August of last year. And the guidelines are really the next step in advancing that vision forward. So the basic goals of the guidelines are to ensure the unity of the overall project, but at the same time create differentiation among the different places within the 600 acres. It will direct and guide specific design elements that strengthen the community character and help create that walkable, pedestrian-friendly environment that we have all aspired to for the project. As Steve mentioned, this project will unfold over several phases and potentially many years. So we need a rule book or a playbook by which we can ensure that consistency in the project and achieve these outcomes that we've designed into the framework plan. So these include everything from the design of streets to the design of buildings. The guidelines will also direct and guide commercial development and retail development, as you see here, with the overall intention that when the project is completed, there is a consistency, a unity, and most importantly, it achieves the objectives that the framework plan established. The guidelines are organized in three basic components or sections. First is the public realm. Second is the architecture or vertical development. And third is the signage and wayfinding that will direct people through the project. Each of these three elements have a series of components, and the guidelines will provide guidance around those specific components. And I'll give you a few examples of how that works. In the public realm, one of the things we wanted to guide and provide direction on was some of the components of the framework plan to make sure that the actual documentation in the framework plan is achieved. So there are some guidelines around overall point objectives, such as land use. And you can see on the left in the small gray boxes that the guidelines are all organized with four components. One is the intent. So we want to communicate to the developer what we're trying to guide here or require. The guidelines themselves are broken into three pieces: a required element, a recommended element, and if there's anything that's prohibited. Sometimes we don't prohibit anything, so we'll write none if there's no prohibitions for that particular component. So this is the land use component. We've also provided guidance around density so that the renderings that we've been showing you over the last year come to fruition in the appropriate manner. A new component that we've added to the project is what we call enhancement zones. Because we want a higher level of design finish and design refinement in particular parts of the plan, specifically around district parks or in the central pedestrian hub area, we have established these enhancement zones. And these will require a higher level of finish, potentially a higher design standard for buildings and furnishings. So we think this will lend a nice area of focus to the project. To control and manage the environment of the streets, we've established guidelines on components such as the street wall, which defines how much of the buildings need to be brought to the street edge to give us that character that we desire and to create that walkable 15-minute city that we all want. Another element that we've created specifically for the guidelines is this complicated and detailed chart, which is what we call the building envelope matrix. This basically defines the building envelope for every parcel on the project. So this tells a developer how tall their buildings can be, how set back from the roads the buildings should be. So it essentially gives them a box or an envelope in which they can build their buildings. So this defines, as I mentioned, height, setbacks to all the different roads, and then on the right-hand side to the open space. Some of the other public realm elements we've set or provided guidance on are the setback areas, as well as the sidewalks themselves. To create a 15-minute city, it's important to define and create a very rich pedestrian environment. The sidewalk environment is going to be very important to create this walkable place that we have designed. And that includes everything from street furnishings to even paving standards. So you can see here in the red box that we do differentiate in the enhancement zones from the non-enhanced areas. So in the non-enhanced areas, we may have a standard concrete paver, but in the enhanced areas, we might have a granite paver or something like that. And Steve, feel free to add anything if you'd like.
You're doing fine.
Okay. We also have specified different furnishings within the public realm. Furnishings are simply benches and bike racks and other attributes of the public realm. We've created a enhanced version of the furnishings, and we've also begun to correlate the guidelines with the City of Draper requirements. The City of Draper does have specific guidelines around certain attributes of the public realm, such as lighting, signage, and furnishing. So we wanted to make sure that on the at the point we are well correlated with the City of Draper's requirements. Ultimately, the City of Draper may assume responsibility for some of these elements. We've provided additional guidance on the road design. We have, again, correlated the road cross sections, which is the drawing in the upper right, with the City of Draper road standards. So again, the intent here is to not only achieve our design objectives for the point, but also to make sure that when and if the roads are turned over to the City of Draper, they meet the City of Draper design standards. We've also defined guidelines for the parks and open space. This is a component of the public realm. You can see this map from the framework plan, which specified all the different types of open space we will have at the point. And we've created specific guidelines for all of these types that show, as in this chart, what is required, what is recommended, and what might be prohibited within the specific park types. This is to make sure that the parks are designed and constructed in a manner that is consistent with the framework plan, and we don't end up with the wrong uses in parks that require certain design outcomes. As I'm sure you're all very interested in is the design guidelines for the buildings. We have, as Steve mentioned, discussed and advanced these together as a team with the staff over the last 6 months. We've also reviewed these with outside developers. So we've gotten external opinions on the design guidelines for buildings and many of the other elements. But our goal here really is to reflect a unique tech-forward, Utah-specific building standard that might be rooted in some of the building traditions currently in the Salt Lake Valley, but also reflect contemporary building practices and current best practices in the development world. So we want the buildings to be both modern, in alignment with the innovation aspect of the point, but also connected to Utah and the specific climate here. We have provided guidelines on residential, mixed use, and office buildings, as well as many other types, including low density residential and commercial and retail buildings. And we've also included in the design guidelines some guidance on color and materials. And this in particular was very much driven by some presentations and study that we did around traditional Utah building standards and building histories. So the goal here is to have a architectural material palette and color palette that is very much connected to this particular place. And we think we're on our way to doing that. The final component of the guidelines was the signage guidance. And here you can see an example of the types of materials that we have provided guidelines on for signage within the project. There's going to be many types of signage in the project. There may be particular signs in parks, on roadways, for building development. So the guidelines begin to create standards for all of that. And the guidelines also have created specific recommendations for architectural signage. On the left, the types of signs that might be on buildings. And then on the right, we've actually provided some examples of what we call signage programs. So this is for larger signage programs such as the River to Range Park, which was mentioned earlier, may have a specific sign program. But also developers who may take 3 or 4 parcels within the project may want a signage program for their individual development. So that is on the lower right here. So again, guidance on all of that. And I'll let Steve speak to this slide a bit, but we have specified how design proposals will be reviewed. There's essentially a 4-step process. And on the right-hand side, we've provided a variance, what we call a variance for excellence. So we know that not everybody may be able to meet or may not want to meet all of the guidelines that might apply to their project. So we have allowed variation within the program if a developer comes in with a better idea, or if they want to elevate their buildings to an even higher standards, we are able to accommodate that. Steve?
Thanks, Pete. Excellent job of overviewing. The only comment I'll make on the design review process is this is a bit of an oversimplification. Different types of projects will actually have different steps. You know, if we're doing a phase 1 master plan, for instance, there will be, additional steps of, of visioning, concept level, and then design development. But this is just shows that there would, for any project, there'd be multiple steps of review from the meeting with the proponent before any design, so we can get them well oriented to the project and our vision and the key vision elements, and then all the way down to the design, working drawings, and then final project review as it's being constructed. So there's this the details of this review process are still in process, and will be more detail will be added in the near future. But with that, I will provide us open for questions from the commission, from the board.
Thank you, gentlemen. Well done. Let's go to members of the commission for questions. Let me light your mic there.
I think Steve Handy has a question.
Oh, okay. Steve, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Mayor Walker.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Great presentation, Peter and Steve. Unless I missed it, I didn't hear any indication of LEED kind of certification requirements in terms of building completion and design. Could you speak to that a little bit? How does that all work?
Sure. We've been going through, as you know, we've been going through a process. We call them enhancements program, and one of the enhancements is sustainability. And we have gone through, and I think you've seen it, a very detailed sustainability criteria design process. And so there's a freestanding sustainability guideline, which hasn't yet been inserted into the design guidelines yet. There will also be a progressive mobility component and also a smart city component. All 3 of those are their own sort of chapters that will go into this document. The reason they're not in yet is because we haven't really gotten to the point where they're ready to go in. We have preferred programs on all 3 of those components: sustainability, active mobility and smart cities, smart buildings. But we want to continue and refine our economic analysis of those and the impact that they have, because they're all very ambitious. And we don't want to finalize those and insert those until we understand the economic implications, and also some of the governance and implementation strategies that are required for those. So those are forthcoming, and so to get more directly answer your question, there are a number of different certification programs that are being considered, one of them being LEED. There are others. But what we want to do is really design the community to achieve the goals that we've set out on the sustainability program, and then let the certifications follow and align with those rather than being driven by those. And so there will be some recommendations for certification that will be forthcoming after we solidify these the specific programs.
Hey, that sounds terrific. Thanks very much for that additional insight. Thanks very much. Great work.
Thanks, Representative Mayor Walker. Let's see. Try that one, Mayor.
Could you go back to the building height and minimum height standards?
Sure.
Your slide, if you could.
Can you see that?
I can. So my concern is, and I've been down this road before with trying to set building heights and zoning in our own city. And I don't think 300 is enough. I don't think we should lock it into 300 feet. And we certainly shouldn't do the minimum of 100 feet. I think we should have the minimum taller in the tall building group, much more than 100 feet. The developers will go build what they can do. I think the minimum height might be the most important of the heights as opposed to the maximum. But I'm not comfortable with it just being 300 feet at the max and 100 at the minimum. I think it's an envelope that I've said it all along. I'd like to see this as a bigger development with the potential for iconic buildings, things that are different than this. This 300 feet, 100-foot minimum, that isn't it. And I have an issue with that.
Okay.
I want to hear how we're going to address the way this looks is we're just going to build sort of what we're already building along in everywhere else.
I can address that and appreciate your input on that. And I don't know why I'm not surprised you're making that comment. I would note that the building, and we'll certainly take your comment seriously in consideration. I just want two quick comments on it. One is the building heights are set to a certain degree to establish a pattern over the project, so that we can create a predictable kind of, let's say, topography, of building height, if you will. That some areas we want to be lower, some medium, some higher, of course, being mostly around the core and around the transit stops. And then we also, the other point is that, we, as Peter pointed out, we have this notion of a variance for excellence. And the thought would be that if there is a particular high-rise building that would be a landmark building, that would fall under that category and allow the maximum height to be, varied if it's a unique and special design and has a special place in the community. But other than those two comments, thank you, and we'll certainly we hear you.
Thank you.
This
Steve.
is April. I have a question, but Larry, I'm not sure if somebody else has their hand up first.
No, I think you're next, April, so go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks to Steve and Peter, SOM, everyone for presenting. My only concern is we're going through a pretty rigorous process to hire a master and phase one developer right now. And it seems a little preemptive for the board, SOM, consultant Steve, and our staff to not include that master developer into these design guidelines before we put them in place. I would reiterate with the mayor that I was expecting that we would potentially see probably a little bit higher heights. But I just also think that we need to wait a couple months to get the master developer so that we're not going off on a tangent and then they come in and want to scrap it and they have a lot. I mean, we're hiring them for a reason. They're rising to the top of all the developers for a reason. So I think maybe we should just leave this open a little bit. But I'd really like to hear what other people's opinions are on that.
If I could just comment real quick on that. I think we agree with you. In fact, that is kind of the plan. We feel it's, the state land authority has certain, mission requirements set by the legislature. We felt it was important to get out in front of the development process to establish guidelines that embodied those goals. But at the same time, because the developer is going to have a mix of motivations. Obviously, when they come in, one is going to be to build a fabulous, excellent project that exceeds our expectations. That'll be why we select them. The other thing is they're going to have very hard pressing economic goals and considerations, which are, we are real and also have to be taken into consideration. So we felt it was important to set the stage, but at the same time allow when the developer is. In fact, we're hoping to get comments on the guidelines from the 3 candidates as we meet with them over the next couple months right away. But the idea would be that they would certainly be at the table, and we will be listening to observations that they have on the guidelines for both criteria that they feel are unreasonably restrictive or opportunities for expanding and adding additional substantive content.
Steve, that addresses it perfectly. So I appreciate that, because definitely we're trying to represent the public and all the citizens of Utah and not have a developer come in and it's just a dollar thing and they, completely change it. So I appreciate that. My only side was I was feeling like we weren't including them. So I was hoping it would be some type of joint effort. So that sounds perfect.
Absolutely.
Thanks, April, for your question, and Steve for the discussion. Going to go to our Executive Director, Alan Matheson. I think he'd like to weigh in as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And April, couldn't agree more. I think Steve covered it well, but one point that I'd make is today we're not asking the board to approve these as the final design guidelines. I think the way we're presenting it is that you would approve these guidelines or this draft of the guidelines for us to move forward in discussions with those development partners and others, recognizing that these are going to evolve as we get additional information. So I think that proposed motion is consistent with what you outlined, April.
Thank you, Alan. We've got a question from Jim.
More of it. Is this on? Sorry, more of a comment. And
Okay.
I think Alan just really
Get a little
addressed.
closer to the mic there.
Alan addressed pretty much what I wanted to say. I think the timing is critical here for the draft, emphasizing it's a draft so that we have our first meeting tomorrow with the shortlisted development groups. And it would be great to be able to hand this draft to them and give them the input from the board and get their comments back on them. It's an evolution of a process. I mean, we've met, and the advisory committee, which does consist of 2 developers that we have on retainer to comment, Jim Zaboro and Don White. They've gone through and made their comments and they've had input on it, but we need to get it to the broader groups, the groups that are presenting, and get their input as well. So I think it's critical for us to move a draft forward. And I hear the comments of my fellow board members, and I share some of the same comments. And like Mayor Walker on the height restriction, it may be that it should be unlimited, but it may be that we really want to look at buildings over 300 feet tall and see what they are and see if they are significant enough, rather than just opening that wide open for anybody to propose. So I think that these are discussions that need to be had, and I just want to emphasize it's a draft and it will evolve over time.
Thank you, Jim. Any other questions or comments from the board? Sure, let me go back to the mayor, and then I have a question as well. So Mayor Walker.
I don't want to sound like the broken record, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. I appreciate that it's a draft, but I just want to keep our focus on the concept that what we're building here doesn't necessarily have to get built in this next season. And when you set these minimum heights low, like we have them, you foster the current development standard that we're doing everywhere else. And if we want this place to be different, then we got to start out different. And we're not. We're doing the same stuff. And I know how these developers work. They all have a special pencil and they do whatever pencils, and I get it. But when we did our zone, I'm just using this example where our front runner stop is, we did an unlimited height zone, unlimited density zone. And I thought we were geniuses. We were not. What we should have done is a minimum height zone and a minimum density zone, because what happened is they went and built what penciled, and it was 4-story buildings. They're beautiful. I'm not complaining, but they went to the, like water goes to the easy row, right? And so if we want this place to look like everywhere else, then I think we're sort of setting ourselves in that parameter. And I just want to make sure if this is a draft, we have a chance to make sure we're looking long-term, more iconic, because I worry that devil's in the details, and these details are right where the devil is. And that's where they'll be. They'll build those buildings the way they'll go to the least resistant path. That's what they'll do. It's just how it works.
Thanks, Mayor. And I don't think we ever look at you as a broken record. It's an important message. Let me ask, though, as a follow-up to that, Steve and Peter, or Steve, as I understand it, there is a relationship between office building height and managing parking and traffic. Am I right about that? Do we somehow have to balance those issues?
Well, absolutely. We're right in the throes of a detailed traffic analysis, and even we have an average floor area ratio or density over the site, and it varies. It's higher in the core and it's lower on the edges, which is intentional. But we've already found kind of a tension, if you will, between our goal of having a walkable pedestrian environment where streets are of a scale and a width and a number of lanes that make them accommodate and kind of support pedestrian walkable sort of environments, and the needs of the density that we already have in the plan, which is pushing towards more lanes, more left turning pockets, and wider streets. And so we're kind of struggling with that right now in real time. And, we are absolutely supportive of taller buildings because we think the site deserves it. It's a transit-oriented development. We want to get density around the transit sites and in the core and support the retail. On the other hand, we do have to manage the traffic generation. So I think it's, we just have to continue to walk that fine line and figure out how to get the building heights and the density that the mayor is, and we all support as well, and still have the project, function reasonably well on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from members of the commission? I don't see any hands up and no lights. So with that, again, Peter and Steve, thank you for your presentation. Well done. This is actually on the agenda, as our director has mentioned, for action. And I think it's clear that at least as far as I'm concerned as chair, that the motion we should be looking at is what would you say, Alan, a preliminary approval or conceptual approval?
Have to move forward. The board's comfortable sharing this document with the developer.
Okay. And I think that's a fair characterization if you were able to hear what he said, a conceptual approval or a preliminary approval. And I also think in order for us to have, this is just my own view, in order for those who are going to be interacting with these developers, as April points out, I think it's important that they have at least some idea, even though it's preliminary in scope, as to where we're going. And at some point, come back for a finalization, but it will be with input from Draper City. It will be further input from them, and they've already been part of this process, but also from input from those proposed developers. So I see that Jim has his
I'll
light
make a
on.
motion.
So Jim, will go to you. As I understand, you have a motion.
Yeah, I'd like to move that we approve the draft design guidelines with the intent that this would continue to evolve and we would receive periodic reports on the development as it moved forwards, and then it be brought back for final approval once the design guidelines are completed.
Thank you for the motion. As I understand it, let me see if I can restate it. Your motion is that the commission approve this as a proposed first draft,
Yeah.
preliminary draft, in order to pursue our conversations with developers. Is that your motion?
Yes, and yeah, and then we would like periodic reporting on the evolution of this design guidelines as it progresses, and then the opportunity to review and approve it in its final stage.
All right, thank you. I'm going to see if we can get a second, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. Is there a second to that motion?
Yes, second. Steve.
Thanks, Representative Handy, for the second. So it's been moved and seconded on that motion. Now, discussion to the motion. I know, Mayor, I think you had your hand up.
Does your motion include a highlighted area around building height and minimum height?
With a highlighted area around
Yellow,
building
glaring.
minimum and maximum heights, yes.
And those heights can be changed upon more reasoning by me.
I don't know that it goes that far.
So it could be changed in either direction with.
No, not
with additional
down.
reasoning by the mayor.
Only up,
Yeah.
only up.
So
I just want to clarify, if we can, I mean, we're not locking ourselves in with this business.
we, as far as I'm concerned as chair, we are not locking ourselves in, but I will also say we've got to start somewhere. We
But I'm-
have to start the discussion, but I think his motion would include as a friendly addition that with respect to the building height issues you raised, these are preliminary for discussion.
I would like to take you all out to my unlimited height zone and show you what they do in an unlimited height, unlimited density, without a minimum, so you can see it, because it's a
Okay.
real fact.
Further discussion to the motion that's on the table.
I have a question or discussion. Yeah, I think even though it's preliminary, I think we're definitely guiding this. If we put this out to the developers, they go through the selection process later on, they're definitely going to say, well, we were designing towards your design standards, what you guys put out there. So if it pencils better this way, it'll be hard to ever get us to change it. So I would put out to the mayor of Draper that maybe we need to change these preliminary design guidelines right now before we even put out the draft, because I think it's going to go down that road, and we're going to be putting out to developers that are going to saying that this is what we were pushing.
Okay, thank you, April. Further discussion to the motion that's before us. Senator Fillmore.
Thank you. What is the advantage of having the board adopt a draft that we don't really want?
And you're posing that question.
I guess I'm posing it to the maker of the motion or for an item of discussion. I mean, if we don't want it. So this seems like a common legislative maneuver to me, right? When the chairs want something adopted, let's just adopt this as a draft and then we'll talk about it more. And then it's adopted. And then whenever the chairs decide that it's that we're done, then okay, then we make a motion to adjourn, and whatever has been adopted, that's what now has the board stamp of approval. And my concern is that if this isn't something that the board wants to give its stamp of approval to, then why are we adopting it as a draft? It's just a draft. Can't it be circulated without board approval? If I would hesitate putting the board's stamp of approval on something we don't actually want. I think this is the first time our board has seen it, and adopting it as the board's framework, even in draft form, I think is premature.
Thank you. Further discussion to the motion that's before us. Any other discussion?
I could just make a comment to I think the
Okay,
value,
let's do this. And I think you'd like to respond to that.
yeah,
I'm going to ask you if you can respond to that in summation on your motion.
sure.
Okay.
I get the point. And there are a few really good points. I think we can convey those on, but there is value in putting this in front of the groups that we have right now to get their input and get their feedback. I know there's apprehension about where this draft might go, but I remind you, the motion has it coming back for periodic updates and for final approval. This is not the end game. And I think that if we were to modify it right now, I think it's premature. Steve mentioned the traffic studies that are going on and the building density, the height and the building density is becoming more difficult in that traffic study than we would have anticipated, which is going to create larger roads and so forth. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to determine, exactly what that density will be. I think we're far from complete on that, but there's a lot of factors that go into it. Not just, I want the building that height on that corner. I think it needs to all work together. And, there's going to have to be some give and take. If we want grand buildings at a certain height, then we should do that. And I completely support that and agree 100%. But I think there needs to be a process. If we open that up where anybody could build any height of building on any corner, then there goes our traffic study. So it does need to be maintained and have some order around it. And I emphasize again, this is just the opportunity to keep moving this forward with our development partners that we'll see tomorrow. We could put it in front of them and say, here's what, here's a draft, but it's not been, we're not going to have it approved in draft form by the board. We can go ahead and do that, but I think it'd be preferable to show that we have at least some general support for it, even though we do have some discontent.
Thank you. I'm going to treat that instead of summation as further discussion. And we'll come back to you. And the reason is there are other board members that would like to comment on the motion. So let's go to Dave Wolstenholme. Dave?
Yeah, thanks, Representative. My concern is a lot like April's and Senator Fillmore's, is that if we put this in front of a developer with what's in there right now, they're going to pencil it to that. There's just no doubt about it. Is there any, and I guess my question is to Alan and to you, Representative, is there any reason why that we just don't take that part of it out and say that's under further discussion without giving the guidelines of the minimum or the maximum? And let's see what their thought is without showing that. And I totally get what Steve's saying about the traffic, but it sounds to me like that has not been finalized either. So we're putting out a minimum and maximum without even having the traffic study done yet. So I do think we're getting the cart a little bit before the horse here. And I also understand the work needs to go on. And so if there's a way that we can do it and keep the work going on, but without putting that in the developer's mindset, that this is what we're thinking, or that's what we put our approval on, even though if it's a draft, it's still an approval of the board. And so, and I get the draft part, but I think that's going to be their mindset moving forward. So I'm totally happy with where we're at. If we could just somehow take that part of it out, get the input from the developers before we actually start to put anything in draft about the minimum or the maximum of the height.
So Dave, as I understand, the part that you would like to see taken out would be the building height?
The building heights
And-
with the
and
minimum and the
minimum
maximum.
maximum.
Yeah.
Okay.
And until we get there, and it may be just right. I don't know that until we get the idea and the thoughts from the developer as well as the traffic.
Okay,
stuff
I'm not going to
finalized.
tell you what to do, but would you like to formulate a substitute motion?
I would.
What's your substitute motion?
Substitute motion would be to remove the height standards that's proposed in the plan.
And essentially stay with the original motion, but with that modification?
Yes.
That's your substitute motion?
Yes.
So there's a substitute motion that's been made, and it's been seconded by Mayor Walker. Is that correct, Mayor?
Yes.
So now discussion to the substitute motion. Excuse me, Mayor Ramsey, would you like to speak to the substitute motion?
Please.
Okay.
They say great minds think alike, and I'm going to consider it quite an honor that my thoughts are exactly what Dave just, just expressed. I was wondering if there was a way I appreciate Jim's comments and understand that we need to have something to present to these three potential development partners. And we need to have some guidelines, and they need to have, I think, the reassurance. If they're looking at spending money on putting together plans, they need to know that they have a reasonable assurance from our board that we're okay with what's being presented. That being the case, my exact question was, can we move that forward without specifying a minimum and a maximum height yet, as we continue to use those numbers, doing the traffic studies and figuring it out, and then we can add those in a little bit later, but taking those out and getting their input. Is that enough information to still be able to move forward? That was exactly what I was going to say. And if that seems to work and we have a motion in a second, that's something I'm supportive of.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor. And then I made a little bit of a procedural mistake. I should have gone back to you, Jim, on the underlying motion. Would you like to speak to the substitute motion?
Yes, I would. I want to know, I would like to have a clarification whether this is all of the building types, the minimum and maximum, or just the high rise.
We'd have to ask Dave for clarification on the motion if you know.
I think it would be all of them at this point in the motion.
Okay. So this is, we're discussing the second motion that is before us, and this is a little unusual, but I'm going to ask our consultants, Steve and Peter, or Steve, whether if that deletion is made, do we still have a framework that you feel like we can work with developers on?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's any problem if we want to set aside the building height criteria for a while until we get more input. I don't think that's a problem. I mean, the most of the guidelines are still intact and still set a pretty good set of criteria for them to review and respond to. I would just add that I just want to remind everybody that 300 feet is still a 25-story building, which is twice as tall as anything in that part of the valley. So it isn't really low rise. It's still a very significant building height, and we do have the opportunity for that to be exceeded if the building is designed at a certain level. But that notwithstanding that, I think setting it aside is fine. An end game that we could be considering would be to again, remove the maximum building height on high rise, but also create, and we've done this on other projects before, is pick certain parts of the project and create a minimum building height criteria that would sort of help guide and message that if the market isn't supportive of taller buildings at this point, that those parcels would be held off until the market was supportive of taller buildings. And so that could be something that we could consider down the road as this evolves.
And I take it, Steve, that consideration would come at least in part as we begin working with proposed developers.
That's correct. Yeah.
All right. As a reminder, the motion that is in front of us is a substitute motion to which essentially approves the initial motion made by Jim, with the exception that we would remove from the guidelines, the proposed draft guidelines, any mention of minimum or maximum height of all buildings. That's your motion? All right. Any further discussion to that motion?
I'd just like one other comment.
We're going to let you make that.
Okay, in discussion. So, as we're working through this process, I think it would be very helpful to me as a member of that group that will be making recommendation back here, to be able to know how they're with this draft guideline. And I think taking it completely out would be a mistake, because that's going to be a missed opportunity. I get the whole, Mayor Walker's talked about his area, but he has guidelines completely taken off there, and they still are going to do what they're going to do. I want to know what they're going to propose in this first phase. Is it going to even be within the guidelines that we're setting forth, and do they need to deviate from it in lower heights or higher heights to make the density and to make it work? I think that the information that we'll glean from it is valuable, and as the process moves forward, they're not going to be able to get approved to build a building that's low rise in an area that we do not want it. And so we have a process in place for that in the future. So I'm just making one more plea. I think as we move through that process, it would be very helpful. And I think Steve was alluding to it. Maybe you loosen the guidelines on the one building type, but not overall.
Thank you, Jim. Any further discussion on the substitute motion that's in front of us? I don't see any other requests. So we will go to the maker of the motion for summation, David, and then we will place it for vote.
Yeah, thanks, Representative. I'm hoping that we can have that same discussion with the developers, Jim, that you just referred to, that we would with the minimum and maximum. Of letting them know that all that's got to come back to the board for approval anyway. But by opening the door to allow them to have some flexibility of what that discussion is going to be, I think solves that issue. So I would stay with the motion that's on the table and allow them to move forward. But I think that conversation can be had with the developers of what those expectations would be. I would definitely refer back at some point to Steve and to Peter about what that looks like with traffic and everything else. So I'm not saying that it's not going to be just what it is now. What I'm saying is let's leave the door open until we have discussion with the developers.
Thanks for your summation. The motion that is before us to vote on is that we approve the original motion of Jim with the change that the draft guidelines remove any minimum restriction or maximum restriction on building height. That's the motion. I'll call for a voice vote. All in favor of that motion, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Would any opposed say nay? Okay, let me have the noes. So Senator, Jim, any of our virtual attendees is a no? All right, and help me with the count here. We have how many here? That's 3 nays? Okay, so that's, and I'm a yay. So, oh, I thought it was Jim. And I thought we had, okay, so it's 2 noes and 8 yays. Excuse me, 7 yays. It's kind of hard trying to manage this virtually, you know. So the motion carries, the substitute motion carries, and we appreciate your direction. And I have a feeling that we may be addressing this issue later as we go through the process. So thank you very much. Next item on the agenda is to review the supplemental studies implementation roadmap. During our March meeting, Scott outlined the highlights of the studies conducted on sustainability, smart mobility, and smart city technologies. Since then, our consultants have refined those studies and staff has outlined an implementation plan. This board will soon determine which project enhancements will be included at the point. This will be a difficult decision. The studies include a number of recommendations from our consultants that will be helpful in making that decision. We are also assessing the impact of various project enhancements on project finances, and we'll be seeking ideas from our potential development partners. So Scott Cuthbertson, we're going to turn time to you for your presentation and your update for us, and to have you entertain our questions. So Scott, the mic is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to present. You've seen much of this information before. What's different in this presentation from last board meeting and previous meetings is that we're laying out sort of our roadmap to implement these strategies that we talked about. And there, we anticipate some discussion around those ideas, sustainability, smart city, smart mobility. We had a good discussion last time. There were some open points and questions, and we've tried to address those, but there still are some that are open. that we'll explain in this presentation. But the idea behind the supplemental studies, of course, is to present ideas that help us to foster innovation, enhance quality of life, create world-class sustainability and seamless public transit that you've seen before. I'm a bit of a technical glitch at the moment. Okay, thank you. And where did this come from? We want to just kind of walk through what that visioning process was and where we go from here. So you'll recall we've had a robust public engagement period. 10,000 Utahns provided input into what they wanted to see on the site. We engaged a number of working groups made up of community leaders and experts in these fields. Those ideas and desires were embodied in the framework plan. That framework plan included goals around sustainability, around water, energy, vehicle reduction, et cetera. And then that was the basis for the in-depth analysis that our consultants performed around how to really make these into concrete features on the project. They synthesized through hundreds of iterations of what would be the ideal, the optimal really solution around those features and what were the cost trade-offs and other alternatives, and came up with what we reviewed last board meeting and what's now found in the extensive preliminary reports that were provided to the board, over 300 pages. So I'm sure that no one had time to get through those, but we've summarized those results and want to walk through those at a high level here, and then we'll get into where do we go from that point and really operationalizing these ideas. So you'll recall we have smart mobility. In that recommended scenario, we're looking at an autonomous circulator, would be powered or driven by an individual at first, but at some point in the future, we anticipate that becoming autonomous. That provides great first and last mile options for people coming into the site, coming home or leaving the site. Active mobility and micro mobility, that's basically scooters, electric bikes, other modes. We envision 150 to 200 options around that active transportation. Car sharing, a fleet of 100 to 120 electric vehicles, mobility hubs, which would be sort of these locations that bring these options together, kind of a dynamic place that would be situated throughout the site to make mobility more seamless. And then really a mobility as a service, mobility package, which is an app that would help you understand what's the optimal route to get to and from the site, show you the different options, show you the cost for those options, and would include as well a subsidy to make this more affordable and to improve ridership and adoption. We look at our water strategies. We're considering water efficient fixtures, efficient landscaping, secondary water for irrigation rather than potable water, and then recycling of water as well. For building energy, considering electrification of buildings, high performance building envelopes. We talked a little bit earlier in the design guidelines about supplemental, basically appendix for sustainability. We would be recommending LEED, gold or platinum, LEED accreditation potentially, and then a high degree of solar, 50% solar on rooftops. This would also include a district heating or cooling solution. We're looking at a geothermal option as well as community solar options there. As we look at waste, it would be a pay-as-you-throw program, really incentivizing recycling. We would have community education programs and then standard 3-bin waste collection systems. There were a number of smart systems for smart city technologies that we're considering. Just to quickly recap the categories, there would be the backbone that's required, the conduits, the passive optical network, kind of that foundation that lets you deploy these smart city technologies at the top of them. Smart environments to include air quality sensors, smart lighting solutions, smart utilities, centralized energy monitoring, smart community. This would be smart kiosks, the smart community app, and then we talked about smart mobility. On top of that, we would have smart buildings, which would improve the sustainability of the buildings and really bring in high-tech features into the buildings on the site. You'll recall as well, we summarized these into 3 scenarios. And the idea being, we wanted to see what's the optimal way to achieve these goals with the minimum amount of cost. Who would those costs, who would bear those costs? And that was broken down into a number of different parties, from the land authority, horizontal developer, vertical developer. We talked about the concept of a district association, third parties as well that could come in and team up on this, and trying to make it financially viable, making this able to be born in the market, and trying to keep the premium to these different entities within a reasonable range. We still have work to do in terms of understanding from a or sort of regulatory standpoint, financial standpoint, governance, and technical feasibility of deploying some solutions. We think that each will be deployable. We have parties that we've talked to that have experience in each of them. We have analogs from different projects where these have all been deployed as well. But in terms of understanding the true cost, getting input back from those developers, just as with the design guidelines, we need to share this information, see if it's palatable to them, get their ideas around it, and then work through some of these other areas that I just mentioned. And so that's what this roadmap does. It helps us to outline what are the next steps, where do we go from here, so that we can bring back to the board a final sort of recommended package for approval that is able to be borne by our partners in terms of market feasibility, that's technically sound, and that meets regulatory requirements as well. And so you see summarized here the strategies. We're looking at a number of different funding and delivery models, from public finance, our infrastructure bank, obviously developer investment, and then considering third parties such as an energy service company and a utility district or association. And as we look at the right sort of mix of who bears the cost, we'll be able to deploy these and meet the standards of the project that were outlined in the framework plan and in statute. And so again, we want to look at this through those 4 lenses. You know, what's allowed from a legal regulatory standpoint? What are the barriers? What can be changed? Financially, who will pay for what? We have again, a preliminary view of that, but we need to validate it with our partners. And then third, governance and operational questions. Who will be responsible for the design, for building it out, for operating and maintaining it? Also, what about for smart city technologies, privacy, security, and reporting? We have examples of how this is done in other projects, and we have recommendations around that, but we need to detail that out further. And then finally, the technical side of it. You know, are all the use cases feasible? We believe they are. They've been done elsewhere, but need to really dig into who would be the vendors that we bring in, you know, and look at what their ideas are and the cost trade-offs, et cetera. So our recommendation is to conduct sort of a 6-week create a working group that help us prove the model out, prove the concept, focusing on the higher impact solutions, and then looking at the delivery model and the financing. And so that working group would focus on the sustainability solutions first, the utility district or association concept. Can we bring in third parties such as an ESCO? Can we set up a community solar program and a geothermal solution? And looking at that from a legal regulatory lens, and then from a financial lens as well. This would need to be done for each of the areas of smart city and smart mobility. This is a bit of a more detailed view of how that would lay out. These could be done somewhat in parallel, but they do kind of sequence naturally as you see them here. And that working group would consist of our staff, our consultants, AECOM and Sam Schwartz, who helped to conduct the analysis and the studies. We also are looking at bringing in local volunteer developers, a few of those, to give us a perspective on how they would view this proposal. Would they be able to bear the costs? And then have a few regulatory members on the team, MIV partners, who we'll talk more about later, who have deep expertise in the regulatory and legal environment around utilities and these solutions. And then we would come up with our sort of assessment of the legal constraints and opportunities. We'd have an updated financial output that we would propose to our master developer, and a plan of action on how do we make this happen. Do we need any statute changes, have conversations with other utilities, and really get the broad perspective on how this sort of ecosystem, our stakeholders, utility companies would view this, come back to the board for more concrete solutions and for your approval. So what does this look like in terms of a timeline? We would focus on proving this concept over the next 6 weeks. That would allow us to sort of revise the financials, have a higher degree of confidence in that, having talked to, again, the utility companies, having talked to regulatory experts, and most importantly, our development partners. We would refine that. We would then look at the governance and operational plan and the technical analysis and negotiations. And we would do this sort of in phases. So we'd focus on those primary decisions that need to take place before we award to a master developer. And then as we get into kind of secondary considerations, understanding when do these decisions need to be made before the development agreement is executed. And then for certain components of this, it would be before plans are finalized. This is a representative timeline. We know this could change. It may be somewhat aggressive, but the idea is that we know there are certain decisions that need to be made before other milestones can be achieved. And this roadmap helps us, and this working group helps us to identify those, come back to the board with more clear solutions. So I'll pause there. I know that's a lot of detail that we went through pretty quickly, but happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Scott, for the presentation. Maybe I can lead off just to make sure that I understand. In March, when we had your report, you went through in some detail about all of these sustainability studies, the smart mobility, the smart city technologies, a lot of it cutting edge. And I think part of what we're saying here is these are all grand and may be great, but how do we do this from a practical standpoint, interfacing with developers who are interested in the bottom line, and also from a government and a public perspective as to making sure that we take a practical approach. How far can we go down that road and meet those goals, but also make it a marketable and a feasible project? Am I basically outlining why this working group is important?
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
And this is be about a 6-week process?
More or less a 6-week process to understand from that regulatory and financial standpoint, can we make this work, and what does it look like to do that?
Okay. Questions from the board? Jim?
I've got a few questions. As part of this process, would it amount to coming back with a recommendation? Because all of these scenarios are great, but they assume a different level of financial incentive from the state. I don't know how to put it right. Investment to make them work. And so would you be coming back with information on how those investments might pay back and some sort of a level of investment you think that the state would need to put to make this happen?
That's correct, Jim.
Okay. And then you mentioned LEED, and I just want to understand, are you proposing, Representative Handy talked about sustainability. Are you just using that for a benchmark, or are you leaning in that direction?
It's more of a benchmark. It wouldn't necessarily be LEED, but we wanted to have a placeholder in the model for now.
Okay, I'm good with that. I would just get on my soapbox for a minute. I mean, we had, as the state, we had a high performance building standard, and then we went to LEED. Silver is a standard for a while, which is recognizable. Everybody knows what that means, but we don't have any control over that. And it changed over a few cycles and became unusable, and we went back to our own standard again. So I would just caution against a national standard we have no control over versus something more prescriptive. It could be based on elements of LEED, but if you're just using it as a benchmark, I don't have a lot of objection there. And then just one more concern I have, I look at ESCO as a 4-letter word. which is not really good because we haven't had a lot of experience that's positive. And so if you're coming back proposing ESCOs, I would like to understand how the state would not be liable if that ESCO company folds up and is not able to, if their projections are wrong and they can't pencil the savings that they promised, how is the state not going to be liable and responsible for that loss when that company folds up?
Thank you. Thanks for those comments and also for your question. And I may have missed this, but when we talk about ESCO or ESCO, tell us what that is.
Yeah, that stands for Energy Services Company. It would essentially be a third-party entity that would come in and either design, finance, build, operate, and maintain the community solar or the geothermal system. And then they would receive a return from basically tenants' payments.
Okay. That's just one of the considerations we look at.
Correct.
Is that right? Okay. Representative Handy, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and ESCO is kind of like a third party utility as I understand it, but just a couple of comments. And Peter and Steve knew I was going to ask this question about the LEED certification because it wasn't talked about in your presentation, but Scott went immediately to it. And I really appreciate Jim's really reasoned perspective on that, and I'll just leave it at that. On the community solar, I'm very excited about that. I'm going to go to a community solar conference next week in Denver, and so I'll bring you back some best practices, Scott and Alan, and share with you what I learned. But I think might be the first time we have talked about community solar in a little bit more of a robust discussion about geothermal too, which I have always been talking about. So, all right, that was it. Just a couple comments.
Thank you, Representative. Further comments from the board or questions from the board? Okay, Mayor.
I just want to caution us on this geothermal being, like a really big component of this because it doesn't have a great history out there. I mean, it used to use it, they don't anymore, and there's a reason why. And so I'm with Jim. I'd be really suspect of anybody coming in there saying they're going to turn this geothermal resource into something they can use. There's a lot of solvent or a lot of hard particles in that stuff. We looked at it in Draper at one spot. So solar, yeah, geothermal sounds good, but I don't think that resource is that great out there.
Thanks, Mayor. Further questions for Scott from the board? Scott, does that conclude your presentation?
That does.
Let me ask Alan, Director, any follow-up comments to any of that discussion?
Maybe just briefly, I think you can sense from this conversation and some of the comments made how complex this is. And we're doing things here in Utah, or we're doing things here, exploring things here that have never been done in Utah, and a combination of things that we think has maybe never been done elsewhere. So it puts all of us in a tough situation to be able to evaluate this in a way that we can make informed decisions. And we're sensitive that we give you the information you need to make those decisions. We're also sensitive that we not get too far in front of you. If we're talking about things that are heading down a path you're not comfortable, we want to know that. So part of the purpose of this presentation today is to show where we're going, see if there's any heartburn, if you're comfortable with the process we're setting up so that we can give you, the information you need to make those decisions. We just want to be aware of that. So that's the purpose.
Thank you, Alan, for that. So if this is on our agenda for an action item, I think we'd entertain a motion. I think what the director is looking for and Scott and staff is for an approval of the board of them moving forward, our staff moving forward with this implementation strategy. The roadmap, which also includes forming the work group, right?
Correct.
And undertaking a more in-depth analysis of these strategies and coming back with recommendations, as I said earlier in my comments, as to which ones are feasible and practical and still maintains a marketability of the project. Is there, so the chair would entertain a motion if there is one to be made by a member of the commission. Okay, let's go to you, Jim. Let me get your light on or your mic.
All right, I would move that we would authorize this roadmap and plan to go forward to look at the same sustainability options and then bring recommendations back to the board.
Thank you, Jim. And does that include assembling a working group?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Is there a second to that motion? Thank you, Mayor Walker. It's been moved by Jim and seconded by Mayor Walker that we move forward with the plan as outlined by Scott, including establishing a working group and coming back with recommendations. Discussion to that motion. Not seeing any lights or requests to speak. I'll place that motion for, well, let me go back to Jim. Do you want to sum on your motion? Would you like to talk about why your motion is important?
Yeah, just one comment. I think that I don't want the board here to become a constraint to the process. And right now we have a lot of responsibility to approve everything. And, and that's a good thing. But I think we need to be able to, just like the last item we voted on, we need to be able to keep the process moving forward. And we need to trust the consultants and the team, Alan and his team, and Steve and Aaron and the developer consultants that we have to keep moving forward in the process and give us recommendations back that then we can make decisions on. So I think it's important that we keep moving these things forward.
Thank you, Jim. It's a little unusual for the chair to speak on a motion, but I'm going to. I think we're fortunate to have members of our commission who have some expertise in a lot of different areas. But we don't possess everything that we need to know as a board without doing an outreach. And I think we've done well in that with our consultants. And I think we've done well with that in our public outreach. And when we engage into determining what sustainability plans we should move forward, I think it's important that we continue this outreach process and that we take the feedback from those who are deeply involved in this kind of work so that we can make proper decisions going forward. So with that, I'll place this motion for a vote. All in favor of the motion that we move forward with the timeline, including gathering a working group and coming back with recommendations to this body on these issues of sustainability. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. Motion carries unanimously. So Scott, thank you for your presentation and you have our support moving forward. Next item on the agenda is number 6, contract issues. The board will consider following amendment or certain amendments, and I won't go through those. I'm going to turn the time directly to our executive director, Alan, and let him describe why these things are on our agenda and what we need to do in order to proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And what I'm going to be sharing is a follow-up to what you just discussed. As we said, that we're dealing with a number of challenging, complex issues. It's fun to be looking at them in ways that Utah can lead out. But as part of the implementation process, we need to either adjust or create some new contracts with some of the experts in these areas. So I'm going to propose a series of contract actions for your approval. Slides aren't moving. Let's try something else here. So as you know, we've looked at a series of supplemental studies. We've gone through those, many of them today. They are largely complete, but we're finding that there's some additional information that's needed to head us toward implementation. So we'll be proposing a few additional changes and some additions to the scopes of work for those studies that are in blue on the screen. it's always good to start with an understanding of where we are with the budget when we talk about potential expenditures. So this is kind of our budget forecast at this point. I want to caveat it that there will be some changes to it. You'll see the budget for the year, which was about $3.9 million. Our actuals through last month, so it doesn't incorporate everything spent to date, but through about last month is a little over 1.4 million. As we forecast out where we're going to be at the end of the year, comes out over 2 million. I think we can project that it'll be more than that, and we'll have better refinement as we get closer. A couple of points, though, that I want to make on this. This isn't a budget discussion, but we do have the money for these studies. That's the fundamental message. And then two, just a little background on here. A lot of those savings are because we're trying to stay lean and did not bring on a third staff member this year. We haven't and don't plan to spend contingency funds that have been set aside. We had some professional services in the budget for things like engineering and work with our developers that we will not spend this year, but we will need to carry forward for future years. So we're not going to spend all of this, obviously, but the point is we're in a position to cover these costs. I'm going to go through these just really quickly. AECOM has done our sustainability and tech work, the smart technology work. We're looking to have them help us refine additional scenarios for smart technology and sustainability, look at phasing of those technologies during what phases of development they need to go in, looking specifically at the community solar, water reuse strategies that are a little more complex in terms of not just technical expertise, but also governance. Looking at partnerships, those that can come in and help us implement some of these ideas, and then continuing to do some additional evaluation of financing models and governance models for those infrastructures. And they're proposing a budget of $95,000 to do that work. On the design guidelines, this one's a little different. This is a proposed contract adjustment. SOM has done extensive work over the last 6 months, met their scope, and frankly, because we were asking a lot more of them, we went beyond the scope. They're asking to be compensated for the work that they have done beyond the scope. We'll say that initially they requested about $70,000. We've talked to them and narrowed that down to about 40, but we think that this is fair and justifiable and supports our ongoing work with them. Part of it is a reorganization of the design guidelines into a cleaner format, consolidating it, removing many pages so that it can be a little more workable. Additional work with Draper on their standards and ensuring good coordination. And then work on those enhancement areas with the enhanced streetscapes that we talked about. So we're proposing a contract adjustment of $40,000 there. Baron Pierce has been doing the traffic analysis, and they've largely completed what was outlined in the scope. As we hinted out earlier, we're seeing challenges. The model shows traffic conditions in 2050. So that's a ways out. And there are some areas of congestion, not just here, but throughout the region. So we're not alone in this. But as they look at strategies to address some of that congestion, we're seeing larger road profiles, 6 lanes within the site, 2, even in some cases 3 left-hand turning lanes that would change the character of the project significantly. So we're looking at taking some additional steps to refine that analysis and make it more meaningful. That would involve doing kind of a post-pandemic trip generation study. The models are based on traffic generation pre-pandemic. We think we can gather some additional information and see if there are changes there. Running some simulation models with those assumptions, looking at some revisions to the road network at the site that can accommodate transportation better. And then looking at another scenario that would say, let's get our preferred street network and then look at ways that we can adjust demand to meet that. That'll require, of course, new reporting and some meetings and a cost of just under $40,000. Sam Schwartz has been doing our smart mobility, and we're looking now to head into that implementation piece that Scott talked about with bringing in potential vendors, discussing a potential engagement with them, creating a transportation management organization, which would be an entity that would oversee the circulator, the car share program, the smart mobility hubs, et cetera. And also working with us on identifying grant opportunities so that we can bring in funding from private and potentially federal and other sources at a proposed cost of $30,000. The final piece that we're looking at, and it goes back again to what Scott was talking about, is we look at potential utility districts, the ESCO model, other things. These, in some cases, have been tried in Utah, sometimes haven't. In our conversations with Rocky Mountain Power, they've suggested some potential legal impediments to moving forward. Steve Meekum and Jeff Richards have extensive background working as part of the Public Service Commission, working for the Public Service Commission, working for Rocky Mountain Power. And we would propose that they would participate in this working group process and help evaluate what optimal energy management structures might be, especially from a regulatory standpoint, looking at what's available under existing structures and what changes might be necessary if this board decides it wants to pursue any of those courses. But at a minimum, you need to be aware of what's available under the current legal structure and what might not be. And then outlining steps to implement that strategy at a cost of $10,000. So in total, a little below $215,000. So those are the contract amendments or new contracts that we would suggest to go into this implementation phase.
Thank you, Alan. Questions for our director from the commission? So Alan, I have a question with respect to Sam Schwartz, is it?
Yes.
Part of his evaluation, or excuse me, not his, the Richards energy evaluation. Would that include them weighing in on this what is it we're talking about?
The geothermal.
Geothermal. Would they help us evaluate that?
They would not be looking at the technical side, but would help us look at the governance and legal side of it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Other questions from the commission? Alan, do you have well, let's take the questions. Jim?
Well, I just had one question, and then I could make a motion if you want, but are we, I hear a lot about the geothermal, and if we are really want to pursue that, I think there's evaluation that needs to be done, a geotechnical evaluation and so forth, to be able to understand the potential there. And so I'm just wondering, is that something that you're planning on, Scott? It seems like we're almost doing this backwards, right? We should know whether we have what the potential is before we pencil that into a business or into a model. And so I'm just wondering what we're doing to determine that.
Scott, I've turned on your mic.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we've had some preliminary conversations with other vendors, and they've talked about the need for that. So we need further discussion with them on that. We haven't planned to undertake a geothermal or geotechnical report on our own.
I think Alan wants to weigh in too, if that's okay.
And just briefly, when we talk about geothermal, there are different types. Part of it is the superheated water, and we understand that there's some issues with that, but there is a limited resource there. The other, this group that we've been talking to, they're proposing to come in and put in the infrastructure using ground source heating. So that can be done anywhere, whether there's a kind of what we typically think of as geothermal or not. So there's a potential for that as well on a more regional basis.
Right, I'm aware of that, and there's different ways to do ground source. Some are more effective than others. But I'm just wondering if that's something that we shouldn't be pushing forward and request that we get some proposals on as a board.
It's a good question. I don't know whether Scott or Alan want to comment on that question.
I think that's a great point to bring up. I think for this working group piece, the regulatory and legal work would be focused on kind of the law generally. So it would be looking at both the community solar as well as the geothermal. So we may be able to have the benefit of looking at one and it applying to the other, but it's a good question to raise.
Thank you. So Alan, I'm going to come back to you. Do you have a recommendation for the board with respect to these additional contracts?
I do. We recommend that the board approve these contract actions so that we can move ahead with the implementation piece as discussed in the previous item.
Thank you, Alan. Any further questions for Scott or Alan?
I have something, Mr. Chair.
Okay, let's go.
My hand up.
Representative Handy and then Mayor Ramsey had a comment.
Yeah, great. I like the Meekum Richards partnership. I worked with both of those gentlemen over the years, and they're super qualified to look at this. That $10,000 contract, Alan, how long will that duration be, would you think, of that $10,000 contract? How long will they be engaged?
Excuse me. Okay. Go ahead.
That contract is for this preliminary work that's roughly 6 weeks or so. So it'd be doing the analysis of what's available under current law and what changes might be needed to accomplish various strategies.
Yeah, thanks. I think they're well qualified. I want to make one more comment on the geothermal. I've talked about this for a couple of years. Look, we have the national experts on geothermal at the University of Utah, the EGI Institute, Energy and Geoscience Institute. They are managing a $200+ million contract, the Utah Forge project out in the West Desert, and they're experimenting with expanding geothermal resources. So I would encourage a conversation with them at least on the the aspects of the, I mean, I don't know. I mean, Mayor Walker made his comments and he knows better than I do, but at least, I mean, we have the national experts right here in our backyard that we ought to consult with regarding the asset at the point of the mountain. So that's my comment.
Thanks, Steve. Would you be willing to help connect them with?
Yeah,
our director,
facilitate
Scott?
something. Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Is that acceptable, Scott?
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Representative. Mayor Ramsey.
I just have a question and I want to start it out by saying how much I appreciate SOM's work and what an outstanding job they're doing. Grateful for all of their efforts and what they're doing for us. My question is about the additional work that's been done. And I know you said it was more work than the scope that we gave, right? But there was great value in it. And I can appreciate that. I understand that things like that come up from time to time. I'm wondering, you said, part of it, you said they really kind of cleaned up the plan and took out a lot of extra pages and cleaned it up. And I don't know. Part of my question, I think, is that who put that together in the first place so that we had to make it more concise and clean it up? My only concern is after the fact, a $70,000 scope of additional work, even though now it's at 40. It's so hard to get this funding. It's just so hard to plan. And of course, we have to have some room to understand that things like this are going to come up and happen. And any of us who have ever worked on public projects know that. But any of us who have ever worked with public money know that it is hard to come up with money, and we are scheduled and budgeted so concisely that we don't have a lot of fudge room money to go, okay, well, we actually used this much more and it's going to cost us this much more. And so I just wondered if you could maybe explain that just a little bit more and try to help me understand. I'm just worried that if we continue to see that down the line, I don't know how we're going to budget for it, and I don't know how we're going to pay for it.
It's a great question. And as we said at the beginning, and I think tried to show in that budget update, we've tried to be very lean. and really careful with money and are going to come in under budget this year. But recognize how tough it is to get those funds and that we need to be careful. We wouldn't have it any other way. When we went through this process, we outlined, SOM made their request, outlined the additional work that they felt they did beyond the scope. We went through and evaluated that in great detail, looked at those things where we thought, well, you know, this was part of the scope. They just maybe could have been more efficient in some ways. But we also did find some things where we thought it was legitimately beyond. One example, they went through, they had us approve a structure for the design guidelines. We approved it, they moved ahead consistent with that approval. And then we went back later and thought, you know, there's a structure that's going to work cleaner, better, and be more understandable. And so on our side, we changed the structure that put them in a position of having to go back and change that structure. We made some similar changes along the way. You know, one thing, they had moved ahead, had a pretty significant draft done. Then we talked about these enhancement areas where there's enhanced street design, maybe an address street that is more meaningful and going to be standing out more to the public and more determinative of the character of the project. So that created some additional work. We thought, yes, we've got to be careful with money. We've also got to be fair with those that we're dealing with, especially as we're going to have an ongoing relationship.
I just appreciate that being said. I think additional clarification, we've got people who are going to be listening to the meeting as well, you know, who I just think spelling out that clarification about what that additional scope of work is and what caused it, what it came from, I think is important. I think that's very helpful. And also just want to make sure that as we're going forward, that we're agreeing in advance on additional scope of work, maybe instead of after the fact and going, yeah, that's true. That was more than we scoped and we appreciate it. Now we need to pay for it. I think maybe just being on the same page beforehand and giving a thumbs up beforehand would be helpful. But again, I'll finish with the same thing I started with, and that's that I appreciate the work SOM's done. They've been a fantastic partner.
Thank you, Mayor, for your question, also for your comments. Let's go to Commissioner Wolstenholme.
Yeah, my comments is somewhat in the same line as the mayor's. First of all, SOM's been amazing. But I'm wondering if this commission should give Alan some flexibility with allowing some overruns up to a certain dollar amount so the work doesn't get stalled, but they can move forward. And I think what the mayor said is really critical, that the executive director approves those beforehand. As this process starts, and I've been involved with a few of these different contracts to where it becomes quite intense at the end of the day, and partnerships get ruined that way. But I would suggest, and we don't need to do it today, but I suggest in the future we look at putting together a policy or a process to where Alan, as the executive director, does have the flexibility to add addition to the contract up to a certain point.
Thank you, Commissioner, for the comments. All really good comments. I will say, oh, you weren't done, Commissioner. Did you want to?
No, I'm done.
You're done. Okay. One of the things that we can do, and I think it relates to the mayor's comments, is in the initial contract, if we can address as a separate item potential additional costs with an hourly rate or something like that. And I oftentimes the provider is willing to accommodate that way if they're getting the full contract. And so I think those are all good points, but I also think Commissioner makes a good point that we could give the director some leeway. All of that has to be weighed against transparency, which we have really made an effort to make a priority. Those are all great comments. We are now a little bit or close to overtime on our meeting. So we need to move forward. And with that, this is an action item to approve these contracts. The chair would entertain a motion. Was that the mayor? I'm sorry. That was Commissioner Wolstenholme. Would you like to speak to the motion, Commissioner? No? Motion is to approve these contracts has been discussed and laid out. Do I have a second to the motion?
I'll second.
A couple of seconds there. April and Mayor Walker. Any discussion to the motion? Jim?
Wilson Hewitt made on giving them a little bit latitude on contracts in the future. But to be able to evaluate this, it would be helpful to see the actual proposal that they're putting in front of you. In lieu of that, I did kind of do the math quickly on what assumed hourly wage and the amounts, and I feel like they're very reasonable for the scope and for what the fee is. So I'm feeling good about the fees that are being presented.
Thank you for your comments, Jim. And I've said before, we're grateful to have you on this board with your expertise that you bring to the process. It's very helpful. Any further discussion to the motion? Don't see any other requests to speak, so I'm going to place the motion for a vote. All in favor of the motion to approve the contracts is listed in our agenda as item number 6, say aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. Motion carries. And we'll proceed with approvals and moving forward with those contracts. So the next item on the agenda is titled Project Finance Update. We're going to at some point turn some time to Aaron Talkington to assist us with those issues. I'd remind this board that Utah Code 52-4205-1D allows a public body to discuss a financing proposal for a state development project in executive session. So I'm going to recommend that we go into executive session if we have a motion and a vote to support that recommendation. I would also remind the board that under current law, the vote to go into executive session requires roll call vote, but I would entertain a motion to go into executive session.
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Thanks.
Steve here.
Motion from Representative Hanny. Do I have a second on that? Second by Mayor Ramsey. The motion is that we proceed to go into executive session as provided by law. I'm going to ask Alan to assist with a roll call vote on that motion.
Yeah, if you'll give me your votes. April Cooper,
Aye.
Senator Fillmore, Representative Handy,
Aye.
Mayor Ramsey, Jim Russell, Representative Snow,
Aye.
and Commissioner Woolstenhue.
Motion carries with the required votes by law. So with that, we will, with that, we'll move out of public meeting and move into executive session. Thank you. Those of you who have joined virtually should have received another instruction from CC on how to move into that virtual executive session. Thanks.